discussion. So with that, Ingrid, I will turn the floor over to you.
What a kind introduction. You can see why it's been very easy to work with Doug. He's so gracious. So let me make sure I know how I'm going to move forward. Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much, Doug. And also congratulations to you and Tim and to your steering committee for taking the initiative to do something like this. Doug and I have spoken about it over the years that it really would be a good idea to sit down and think through, because that's what we've been doing at the Center for Environment for some years, what constitutes a good interdisciplinary program in environment as we're trying, as he said, to cobble things together. My own career in philosophy was always running in parallel with other interdisciplinary work. Even when I was doing my PhD in the 70s in philosophy, I was actually working in my father's company, which was an interdisciplinary planning company. And so I think I can't imagine not doing something interdisciplinary in my work. And so I've given a lot of thought to it, as Doug said, but at the same time, I have lots of questions. And I'm really looking forward to sharing this afternoon with you and using it as an opportunity for us collectively to try and thrash through some of the trends and where we really ought to be going. So my comments this afternoon, I've chosen a rather interesting title for the presentation. I was thinking of putting a question mark after it, but then I thought, no, I'm just going to talk about the end of environmental studies. It's going to be somewhat suggestive. My comments are suggestive because truly I'm still learning, and it's not a definitive set of conclusions, but I'd like to share some of the thoughts that I've come to throughout the course of this 30 plus, almost 40-year career in doing interdisciplinary work. So my comments are going to be structured really in two parts. First, I want to ask the question, what is environmental studies? And here I want to focus on issues of language and hermeneutics and historical interpretation without losing you in philosophy. I'm particularly interested to identify some trends such as the division that seems to me to have arisen between environmental studies on the one hand and environmental science on the other. And so I asked the question about the end, that is the goal of environmental studies today, given this rupture that seems to have occurred, as well as whether environmental studies as a genuinely interdisciplinary conversation between the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences is in fact at an end, given this rift that seems to be, in my opinion, on the horizon. And that these impressions come not just because I've worked in interdisciplinary programs, but part of my work as director was to spend about 2 or 3 years working on a provostial roundtable and then eventually a provostial task force on pedagogy and environment. So we did a lot. I had students working and researching of programs across North America just to try and see who was doing what. So the second part of the presentation, I want to actually look at what are some of the implications for program delivery if what I'm describing about where environmental studies stands today is right. And that's a big if, but it's going to affect where we're going. So in terms of actually starting this question about what is environmental studies, I want to start a little bit with history because I'll keep it brief. Many of you know the history, but at the same time, I think that it will help to ground the discussion if we just look back a few decades and see where we've been going. Obviously, we just mentioned that many of the universities like Waterloo and New York are prime examples, where programs started to emerge in the 1960s. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was a big motivation for some of that change. There were also those student demands in the age of Vietnam where students were demanding that some kind of change occur within curriculum. And so not only York and Waterloo, but at the University of Toronto, we formed what was called the Institute for Great Lakes Study originally, and the Indus College Environmental Studies program. They came up in the 70s and eventually have come to be the Center for Environment that I've been running. So internationally, it was 1972 at the Stockholm UN Conference on Human Environment when proposals were actually started to be voiced that we needed some kind of international environmental education program to be developed. And by 1977, the Intergovernmental Conference on Environmental Education in Tbilisi, USSR, concluded, and I'm quoting, that environmental education represented an interdisciplinary approach and was not just an extra subject to be added to the existing curriculum. So during the 1970s, it was an amazing time. I always tell my students, this is the advantage of old age. You can talk about decades and really talk definitively with some authority because you were there. The 70s was an amazing time. The OECD was coming up with amazing documents. Eric Jansch was writing about interdisciplinarity. When you look at the documentation, the reports that started to emerge about interdisciplinarity, all these terms started to emerge in the 70s. What multidisciplinary, pluridisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, polydisciplinary, non-disciplinary, undisciplinary. It's all. Pick up the Klein's book. It's a fantastic history where you can begin to recognize that this link was starting to be made between environmental studies on the one hand and the need for some kind of interdisciplinary collaboration. Even though obviously it could occur, even then it was recognized that it could occur in many different ways. So I think that one of the things I feel is that this link between environmental education and interdisciplinarity is just as strong today as it was in the 70s. My own commitment remains absolutely secure in the belief that what we need to do when we're studying environment is encourage true interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary conversations between humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences. But I think still things have evolved, and I want to look at this particular shift that I think has happened. In my view, the term environmental studies, when it emerged in the 70s, was meant explicitly to include the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences in a genuine interdisciplinary manner. There was a belief that true progress in understanding could really only occur with genuine dialogue among even the most disparate disciplines. That was the tenor of the times, that was the culture. And the spirit of that time is, I think, nicely reflected in the words of Waterloo English professor Andrew McMurray, who reminds us that, quote, by resisting the compartmentalization of knowledge, faculties of environment a fortiori resist the compartmentalization of the world. And I really think that sentiment, that what we were looking at, whether it was acid rain or today global climate change, we can't compartmentalize those problems because they're so complex. So this was the spirit of the term environmental studies. But I think something's changed. I think more and more environmental studies has come to be differentiated from environmental science. And not only environmental science, but science as a life science, correct science. I was talking to a scientist the other day, and she said, "Yeah, I'm in a faculty of environmental studies, but I'm really not doing environmental studies. I'm doing environmental science." I'm thinking, how did that happen? What happened there? So I think that this has happened. That I think that this shift has been gradual, but in my view, quite real, in the sense that I think it's also affecting curricular change. Changes within universities and perhaps affecting the environmental community as a whole. So I would really like to spend a few minutes talking about this trend. Should we accept it? Do we reject it? Do we fight it? If we accept it, what do we do with it? So now there's some people who say, well, it's just a mistake to separate the two. We just shouldn't be doing it. And maybe we're not really doing it. And in fact, when we were collectively, Doug was there, we were proposing a graduate master's, the first direct entry program in an interdisciplinary environmental program at the University of Toronto. The dean at the time said, we wanted to call it a Master's of Environment. And she said, no, can't call it that. Really, you should call it environmental studies. The way women's studies suggest there's something interdisciplinary. Environmental studies also indicates that there's something interdisciplinary. At the same time, of course, while she was dean, we had just launched a Master's of Environmental Science at U of T. So the relationship between this Master's of Environmental Science, which was at Scarborough, we're not supposed to call it satellite campus anymore, we're supposed to call it East-West campuses, so UTS, University of Toronto Scarborough, had the Master's of Science program developing at the same time as we were developing a Master's of something on St. George. And now there's a PhD in environmental science at the University of Toronto Scarborough, and we still don't have downtown that Master's program. We can talk about why. Maybe we will have someday. I don't think at the time it was clear to the dean what the difference was going to be between this Master's of Environmental Studies on St. George and the Master's of Environmental Science at Scarborough. And I don't think it's clear to this day to people at U of T what the difference is and what it should be. And I'm not the only one who's having this problem. My friend Robert Frodeman, who's director of the Center for the Study of Interdisciplinarity at the University of North Texas, he agrees that while environmental studies is one of the few areas that actually aims to integrate humanities, sciences, and social sciences, he still says, quote, environmental studies have difficulty distinguishing themselves today from environmental science, which in turn strives to define itself as a science. So my concern today is to understand why this differentiation is kind of bubbling around the surface, assuming that we're right about this. So some of the change, I think, has to do with something that has accompanied this conversation for decades, and that has to do with the academic integrity of interdisciplinarity, the whole breadth versus depth discussion. There's a perception that continues, I think, amongst many of our colleagues, that interdisciplinarity leads to superficial understandings of many different fields, and that disciplinary depth and rigor are often sacrificed in the process. In 1995, Michel Soulet and Daniel Press acknowledged that, quote, since environment encompasses the world around us, environmental studies as a field is virtually limitless, unquote. Doug was referring to this earlier. I think on the one hand, they have a point. On the other hand, anything that's virtually limitless becomes difficult to, I'm going to put the words boundary from our presentation this morning, how are we going to bound it in some kind of a horizon of interpretation that means that we know something more than everything about everything and nothing in particular. So in that case, providing, as Doug has said, some kind of general direction seems to be felt as a need in this field of environmental studies. And one way I think that this is happening is that this rift is occurring between the scientists who feel that they would like to be interdisciplinary, but they haven't got much to say to me as a philosopher, and others in the humanities, the arts, languages, who are not having a conversation with the sciences. So this is where I think part of the explanation is as to why this rift is occurring between environmental studies, environmental science. There's this aim to sort of provide some kind of interdisciplinary rigor through some kind of bounding process. So a second reason, I think, for the division between environmental studies and environmental science may have something to do with a gradual shift in the meaning of interdisciplinarity itself. Now, you remember that in the 60s and the 70s, one of the primary differentiations that was made at the time was between interdisciplinary programs and multidisciplinary programs. Multidisciplinary programs were seen to sort of juxtapose different disciplines around a single topic, the elephant example, with no apparent connection between the disciplines. And in that sense, there was this additive dimension. But interdisciplinarity was supposed to be something better than this. It was supposed to be integrative. There was this explicitly integrative dimension, and I refer you to something like the Club of Rome's 1972 Limits to Growth book. Remember how they actually aimed to provide a single, universalizing, quote, I'm taking right from the book, formal written model of the world, unpublished. That was pretty ambitious for environmental studies. And then there were other things going on at the same time. I got quite involved in acoustics. It was supposed to be the interdisciplinary science, actually, of human settlements. And ultimately, the aim, once again, was always synthesis. So interdisciplinarity at the time meant that we were going to have this synthesis, this integration between the humanities, the sciences, and the social sciences. And in a sense, when you look back there, I think they were pretty courageous times. I think that there was implicit faith in these computer models that were going to give us futuristic diagnoses about what we were to expect. And this notion of synthesis, everybody felt this was going to be a better world with a sort of synthetic approach. And I think it was in that era that environmental studies similarly promised to provide an educational platform that was more than just a multidisciplinary compilation of different perspectives, but rather promised some kind of interdisciplinary integration of the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences. But as we learned this morning, the first modernism, second modernism, we talk about postmodernism in my discipline. And I think in an increasingly postmodern world, I think there was skepticism that began to emerge about the possibility of that kind of synthesis. Any notion of a single overarching interdiscipline of environmental studies began, in my view, to give way to a recognition that interdisciplinarity did not mean any longer constructing a holistic vision that constituted a kind of large superpart. On the contrary, I think that holistic vision started to change a little bit, and it started to indicate a more fluid process rather than a superpart product. We were no longer convinced that we could come up with a formal written model of the world. So interdisciplinarity and holistic thinking started to emerge a little bit differently. People began to question what it was all about. In my own area of environmental ethics, I teach environmental ethics courses at the University of Toronto. It's really interesting when you look at the theme of ethics. You think of ethics as providing you with rules and principles to follow so that you know what's the right thing to do. But actually, ethics have become, especially environmental ethics, there's more of more and more growing interest in ethics as bioregional narrative. The idea is that we're going to tell the best stories we can, to use Jim Cheney's phrase. And there's this resistance to it, what they call totalizing, essentializing, universalizing narrative, and of synthesis, but rather ethics becomes the subject of social negotiation. It's fluid. It's not. There's no formal written model anymore, even of ethics of the world. So, and this has emerged both because I think that bioethics has kind of opened the door to environmental ethics, where praxis becomes important. So when you're in the messy world of everyday decision-making around environment or bioethics, working with medical doctors, and you see that decisions don't have these preset theoretical answers that sound nice in the classroom, they don't make sense out in the lived world, then that formal written model becomes suspect. And then also, second, I think that case studies have begun to inform my discipline in a different way. There was this notion that no longer is ethics a universal agreement about some kind of monistic theoretical grounding for morality, but rather particular cases were going to inform a conversation that was very, very broad, and ethics was going to become a little messier. So, to summarize, constructing a single, holistic, synthetic interdiscipline called environmental studies has come to be suspect for a number of reasons. One, interdisciplinarity without disciplinary grounding came to be seen as aiming to know everything, but nothing in particular, and therefore environmental studies and interdisciplinarity, I think, has come to being seen by many people as superficial, and even, I'll use the word, flaky. And for this reason, environmental scientists have increasingly turned to the scientific disciplines as an indication that they are still engaging in what Freud would call best science. This turn has not meant that the humanities and the social sciences have been completely abandoned, even in that move, but rather that the primary collaboration has been between the scientific disciplines, acknowledging at best that there's still room for something to be said about the humanities and the social sciences. And then I see the second reason that has become suspect is this postmodern skepticism. The postmodern turn has invited plural perspectives, meaning that the phenomena of difference and dialogue have come to replace the holistic vision of synthesis. Once again, with a growing skepticism that this single overarching interdiscipline of environmental studies could be defined with any degree of academic rigor, the tendency has been, I think, to define interdisciplinarity as an iterative process of networking, moving between disciplinary depth and interdisciplinary breadth, as Doug was just describing what he does on a daily basis, certainly what I do on a daily basis, rather than striving for a single methodological synthesis. So far, I've been just describing my impression of what goes on. Now I move a little bit to ask the question, is this a good thing? Or is this a bad thing, what's been going on? So I wanted to move to a sort of prescriptive moment. If a natural separation is evolving between the humanities and the social sciences on the one hand, environmental science on the other, does this mean the end of environmental studies as we've been defining it in the 1970s? If so, should we fight this trend as indicating something problematic, or accept it, acknowledging the postmodern turn, but toward diversity rather than this monistic synthesis? And I think these are tough questions. I'm not sure I have the answers, but let me share with you where I'm tending to go on this. First, I want to suggest that when such paradigm shifts occur, they tend to happen not arbitrarily, but because of shifting general consensus on the ground that changes are in some sense called for. In other words, there may be good reason for these shifts, and these reasons deserve to be respected. If so, it may mean the end for, quote, environmental studies, end of quote, as a single interdiscipline. Perhaps then the term should be avoided in curriculum planning, and in fact that's what we've been struggling with, and I'll tell you that story in a few minutes at U of T. Second, I think that if this is the case, I don't want to suggest that it's the end of interdisciplinary study of environment. I'm strongly committed, and in some sense very much lamenting this division that's happened over the decades between environmental science and environmental studies. So I'm strongly committed to interdisciplinarity. But maybe if what I'm describing is right, there's also an opportunity. With every crisis, as they say, comes an opportunity. And maybe there's an opportunity for us to actually start to design programs that are a little bit more resilient, maybe even more rich, maybe even more diverse, maybe even more meaningful when it comes to studying environment. And maybe there's going to be a valid range of perspectives from the pluridisciplinary, where just sciences come together for something, to something broader. And in fact, I think I'd like, because I'm always looking to the positive, for those of you who know me, I'm going to suggest that maybe there's some opportunity here that we can all benefit from, and rather than sort of scratch our heads and worry too much. At the same time, I want to say something about language. I think language is a funny thing. It often evolves without our explicit attention to shifting meanings. And I would say to my students, if I turned around, I said to Doug McDonald, Doug, you're wearing a really groovy shirt today. My students know, and you would know, that I'm either very old or I'm a real Austin Powers fan. It says something about language is saying something that may not be explicit. So when we talk about environmental studies, I think there were many, many positives around the term environmental studies when it was originally conceived. I think it really signaled a courageous endeavor to address complex problems from a truly interdisciplinary perspective. And I think that interdisciplinary perspective is needed just as much today when we're talking about issues of global climate change as when we were talking about acid rain decades ago. So, in fact, I would just pull this out of one old article. when you think about what contribution environmental studies brought to different perspectives, from atmospheric sciences to water policy to soil ecology to environmental ethics, it really was an inspiration for people to start to talk across the disciplines. And I think that deserves to be absolutely celebrated. On the other hand, as positive as I think that was, I do look at things like the Association of Environmental Studies and Sciences. This is a group from, as you know, Washington, D.C., and they're not called the Association of Environmental Studies. They've added "and Sciences" for the very reason that seems to be capturing what I'm talking about today. So the question is, do we follow their lead and no longer refer to environmental studies, but only to environmental studies and sciences? And does the language matter at all? I think that language does matter. I do hermeneutic work, and I think it shapes and reflects meanings in our society. In fact, it shapes and reflects very deep-seated paradigms and values that I think are important to understand. Now, it's possible that through language, we actually fight paradigms. We actually fight worldviews. One of the philosophers I studied, Martin Heidegger, he refused, in his early work anyway, ever to refer to human beings as human beings. He said, no, we need a new language. In order to think differently, we need a new language. So Dasein is going to be the word that I use, being there. It's a long story. But anyway, his whole philosophy was language both reflects paradigms, but in order to change paradigms, we have to use language, move it back, shift it back. So maybe some of you will say, we got to force people to rethink what environmental studies really meant originally and sort of still capture it and stop adding the sciences to it. The sciences were in environmental studies right from the start. What happened that they left? When did they leave? So there may be a case that we just collectively all say, yeah, we're going to fight this trend. But then another case is to find a different language, and that's one. And Doug referred to it, obviously with the Brundtland Report in 1987. The term sustainability hit popular consciousness. I know about the critics of the term. I've written a book about it. It's called Safeguarding Our Common Future, Rethinking Sustainable Development, and there I address the critics of sustainability and sustainable development, and I think Doug has indicated some of that criticism this morning. So I'm well aware of the critique that sustainability just serves to propagate the very way of thinking that's brought us to the current state of problem that we have, environmental crisis that we have. Personally, I think that there is actually more positive to be gained even out of that term. And actually, I have colleagues out at UBC, John Robinson is one of them, who says, I don't get it. I don't know why you guys don't like the term sustainability. It works for us out west, but I just don't understand why no one in Ontario wants to use the term sustainability. So that's one option. But in our case, it's not the option we took at the Center for Environment. So I'll quickly end the presentation by describing to you very briefly how some of this thinking influenced us at the Center for Environment. So is it better to talk about sustainability? We opted for the study of environment, hoping to bypass quietly this controversy and come up with something a little bit different. Now, in forming the Center for Environment, I'd like to just show you that we had a couple of priorities, at least these two priorities. One, we were absolutely committed to interdisciplinarity, and we also recognized that there were disciplinary contributions. If a chemist wants to do environmental chemistry and doesn't want to talk to anybody but chemists, good, something to be said for that. You don't want to toss them out the door. And there also are those people who can be chemists, and I've worked with them. I worked on a team of 30 researchers. It was a research project with 6 universities, 30 researchers. I was supposed to provide the integrative framework. We could talk about how I did that some years ago in the 90s. But I worked with this group of sociologists, philosophers, and chemists. The chemist was the most collaborative, broad-minded person in the team. So both interdisciplinary and disciplinary contributions are incredibly important. And we had to, I think, face this dichotomy that seemed to be arising between environmental studies and environmental science. I'm particularly worried, I should add, about the dichotomy, mostly because what's happening in my view is that environmental science is coming to be privileged over environmental studies. And once again, I don't know if you've heard of Martha Nussbaum. She writes beautifully about the place of the humanities and how they're being lost. She says, the humanities and the arts are being cut away in virtually every nation of the world, seen by policymakers as useless frills at a time when nations must cut away all useless things in order to stay competitive in the global market. They're rapidly losing their place in curricula. And so I'm worried that environmental studies may be seen as this frill that needs to be cut out. We're just going to, and I'm worried that that's actually a tendency that's underlying a lot of the emphasis that the University of Toronto has given to environmental science programs, but they don't know what to do with the Centre for Environment, which thankfully they're actually keeping and turning into a school, but I don't think they know what it's going to do. So anyway, so I think that this is, so how do you best maintain this dialogue and retain flexibility? And what we did at U of T, we decided to call this a hub and spoke model as we were creating the center. And Doug is absolutely right. We didn't have the sort of wonderful opportunity that York and Waterloo had, where they just became faculties. And we're faculty of environment or faculty of environmental studies at U of T would just never fly. So what we did was we said, okay, it's going to be a center now to be called a school as of July 1st. It's a hub and spoke model. So it's supposed to suggest that there is an interdisciplinary, genuine group like Doug and like Stephen to some extent and the others who are actually doing the interdisciplinary work of environmental studies as it was originally conceived in many ways. But also there are these spokes that are sort of connecting to other departments and beyond. I think Kate Sharon, who has done some, I think, really interesting work in interdisciplinarity, she says there are two structural models in use right now in Canada. One is what she calls departments, and I think she also means faculties, and the other are networks. Well, I would say we followed this network model. So we certainly had both BA and BSc programs, but the emphasis, and these were our core programs, but the idea was that even if you were doing environmental science, you weren't going to get away with doing no philosophy or no social sciences. And if you were doing philosophy and the social sciences, you weren't going to get out of the program without knowing something about ecology and something significant, and not just enough to say no to the naysayers for global climate change. You had to know something about science. So it was the emphasis in the planning that became important. We had a number of collaborative departments who signed, in fact, we had 26 memoranda of agreement that we signed with different departments across the university in order to formally engage them in the interdisciplinary study of environment. And we decided to call it the Center for Environment, now to be called the School of the Environment, and not Environmental Studies. We explicitly avoided it because we did not want to add to the confusion surrounding this term. Now, one other thing, there are also more spokes. Coming to the end of my comments, I think the spokes also have to extend to the broader community. One of the most exciting things that I think the Center for Environment developed was professional development programs. We had programs in environmental finance and GIS, environmental management, etc., for people who are already out in the field. So it became both a way of providing educational programs to people who were working and had graduate degrees or undergraduate degrees, as well as to establish really strong connections with the community. And I think that rootedness in praxis, I think, is a driving force to ensure that we mustn't lose that. And I'm just going to give you a really quick story as I end this. It's the story of Socrates and why praxis is so important to academic planning. So Socrates was approached one day by an acquaintance who said, "Oh, I have to tell you something about Diogenes." And Socrates stopped him being Socrates and said, "Wait a minute. before you tell me anything, I have to run this through the triple filter test. The first filter is truth. Have you made absolutely sure that what you're about to tell me is true? And the guy says, well, no, not really. I just heard about it. Okay. You still have a chance. There are two more filters, so you really don't know if it's true. Let's try the second filter, the filter of goodness. Is what you're about to tell me about Diogenes something good? No, not really. No, on the contrary. Okay. So you want to tell me something about Diogenes that may be bad, even though you're not certain it's true. The man shrugged, a little embarrassed. Socrates continued, and he said, okay, you still may pass the test. You may pass through the third filter, and that's usefulness. Is what you want to tell me about Diogenes going to be useful to the conversation? Well, actually, not really. Well, says Socrates, if you want to tell me is neither true, nor good, nor even useful, why tell it to me at all, or to anyone at all? So the man was bewildered and ashamed and walked away, and this was why Socrates was seen to be such a fantastic philosopher following his principles, but it also explains, the story goes, why Socrates never found out that Diogenes was sleeping with his wife. So keeping your ear to the ground becomes incredibly important. And not only to catch those moments, but also, I think, to ensure that there are plural perspectives. I've been telling you about our story at the University of Toronto. I think Kate Sharon has it right, that one of the positives about this evolving field called environmental studies is that we're all doing it in different ways. And I'd like us to keep trying to do it in different ways, which is why this opportunity to talk about it today becomes so important. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn the floor to everyone else now. So Doug, do you want to help me handle questions? Or?
Sure.